Right. Hey guys, wanted to first off start by saying, um, excellent work on your reviews this week. I was um, very impressed with your performance on the thematic review stuff. I thought you guys did a fantastic job. The thematic stuff, it may seem a little repetitive and redundant, but at the end of the day, whenever you're writing these LEQs here in a couple of days, having that thematic evidence to help you out is going to be a game changer. So, excellent job. Hopefully, you guys got something out of the thematic review. Hopefully, it wasn't something that you felt was kind of a time waster. I think it, helps logically sort things in your brain and allows you to connect terms between time periods, right? So, excellent job with those. I wanted to go ahead and do period 4 and 5 together, simply because, you know, um, I wanted to make sure that I could get everything done in time. Number one. And number two, my internet's been kind of spotty. I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to do two. So I'm going to hope that we can get through both of these in one go. Okay. Um, Last period, period 3, finished with the Adams presidency. The period 4 begins with the election of 1800 and Thomas Jefferson. Um, Big things from Thomas Jefferson. First, the Louisiana Purchase. The land gets purchased after France kind of runs into some trouble with the Napoleonic conflicts and needs some money. Um, the main reason Thomas Jefferson purchases it is to expand the agricultural future of America. Remember, he's a Democratic Republican, and their ideas for America's future is agriculture. So Jefferson saw it as a golden opportunity to be able to expand the size of the United States and um, help provide more farmland for the American people. One big issue with it, though, is there's no real technical amendment that allows the executive branch to purchase land. So Jefferson has to kind of go back and use a loose constructionist viewpoint, which is kind of counteractive to what the Democratic Republicans believe, to purchase the land. This was, of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And another big thing, and probably the most important going forward, is it does kind of create the Native American issue. Most of this was Native American land, and culturally, Native Americans are quite different from Western or American settlers, right? During Jefferson's presidency, we see Henry Clay's American System, the plan created by Henry Clay to create a national economy through protective tariffs and national bank and improvements to U.S. infrastructure. This leads to the creation of the Erie Canal, number one. Number two, it starts the nullification issue, or not the nullification issue, but it begins the sectionalist divide that kind of leads to the northern and southern identities on agriculture and industry. Remember, the North was very headstrong on industry, while the South was very headstrong on agriculture, and it kind of eventually results in a sectionalist divide that we see throughout the end of period 4 and all of period 5. Okay? Sorry about that. Um, Jefferson also sees the Marbury versus Madison Supreme Court case in the very beginning of his presidency. That's the court case that established judicial review, strengthening the Supreme Court. We see the passage of the 12th Amendment, which made VP and presidential candidates vote on separate ballots so that the runner-up for the presidency would not become the vice president. It would have caused issues during the 1800 election cycle because Jefferson and Madison were from opposite political parties, and you can already kind of determine how that went based on how the Federalists felt about the Democratic Republicans. Lastly, the Embargo Act issue. What it was designed to do was to retaliate against Britain and France and maintain U.S. neutrality, but it led to economic backlash, particularly in the South, and widespread smuggling throughout America. It was replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act, which attempted to restore trade and stop impressment, but ultimately it's just as unsuccessful. Same thing with Macon's bill. Wasn't really successful at all. Didn't quite help anyone, in the South rekindle the economic success that they had whenever the embargoes and non-intercourse acts were there. So ultimately they're kind of done away with. Okay. Moving on to James Madison. First, the Hartford Convention, a gathering of New England Federalists who were concerned over abuses of power by President James Madison in the Democratic Republican Party, particularly during the War of 1812. The idea of secession was discussed. It was ultimately rejected. Moderates led the convention, proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution to safeguard Northern interests, including restrictions on presidential terms and altering slave representation, and it continues debates on federal versus states' rights. Remember, this is what kind of sends the Federalist Party on a downward spiral where they eventually get replaced by the Whigs. Okay? War of 1812 was a military conflict fought between the U.S. and Great Britain from 1812 to 15, sparked by a variety of issues, predominantly by impressment of American sailors by the British Navy. Significant battles, including the Battle of Lake Erie and the Battle of New Orleans. That's where you see Andrew Jackson get his claim to fame and eventually would rise to stardom and become the United States president. Ended with the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, related to the War of 1812, the Warhawks, a group of young nationalistic U.S. congressmen, primarily from the South and what was considered the West at the time, which was the Louisiana Purchase border, the Western Louisiana Purchase border, who fiercely advocated for war with Great Britain leading up to the War of 1812 due to Britain's harsh trade restrictions and the continuous arming of Native American tribes in the West. Remember, Britain still had some of their relations left over from the American Revolution. In an attempt to stop expansion, right? Prominent members, John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. No surprise there. We always talk about how John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay are pretty much everywhere during this time period, and that doesn't change anytime soon. Macon's bill was intended as an alternative to the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 and stipulated that the U.S. would continue to have open trade relations with France or Britain if those powers enacted policy changes that provided for more protections for American merchants and acknowledged American ideas of neutral trading rights. Ultimately, doesn't go over well because guess what? Britain kind of just keeps impressing sailors. And that's how we get the War of 1812, right? Moving on, after Madison is James Monroe. James Monroe inherits the country towards the end of the War of 1812, and his presidency is known as the Era of Good Feelings. The Era of Good Feelings was a period in American history from 1815 to 1824. It followed the Jeffersonian era of politics and preceded the Jacksonian era. It was marked by a sense of nationalism and patriotism following the War of 1812 and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. The dominant political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. However, this time period saw the decline of the Federalists, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the only true political party. Remember, James Monroe runs unopposed for the presidency and kind of secures the win. Key Marshall Court decisions underneath both Madison and Monroe. Both of these are under Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall. First one, McCulloch versus Maryland. That is an issue over the chartering of the Second National Bank to help deal with the debt incurred by the War of 1812. The state of Maryland passed legislation to levy taxes on any bank not chartered within the state, and technically, since it was a federal bank, it wasn't chartered within the state, so they kind of got away with that through a loophole of legislation until the Supreme Court, or the cashier, who was the cashier at the National Bank, brought it to the Supreme Court, which said that under the necessary and proper clause, made the National Bank constitutional and that they can't be taxed. And states don't have power to levy taxes on the federal government, right? Second one, Gibbons v. Ogden, that is expanding the powers of the Commerce Clause, allowing Congress to regulate interstate and some intrastate commerce originating over a shipping monopoly in New York. A key piece of foreign policy by James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The purpose of it was to prevent European colonization and the establishment of puppet regimes in the Americas. It wasn't enforced early on. It became a staple of American foreign policy over time, and it was invoked in various disputes with European powers and interventions of Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries, most notably with Theodore Roosevelt's Roosevelt Corollary, which is considered by most historians an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. After Monroe, John Quincy Adams, remember the corrupt bargain election. During John Quincy Adams's, during John Quincy Adams's presidency, we start to see the issue of nullification begin. We also see the corrupt bargain election, where Jackson claimed that the election was corrupt because Henry Clay made a deal with John Quincy Adams in exchange for more political power. He would have given John Quincy Adams the seat as president because Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, and in a tie, the Speaker of the House decides the presidency at the time. And this was highly influential in more states across the U.S., pushing for increased white male suffrage, which ultimately is achieved in most states by the end of Adams' presidency, with universal white male suffrage being achieved in the 1850s. Okay, remember there's no official amendment, but most states voted in by the mid-1850s. Moving on, Jackson. The AP test loves Jackson. He's a huge portion of American politics because of his ideas on representative democracy and how common people should have more of a say in politics because, because at the time, most of the people who were making the political decisions, most of the time, the people who were making the political decisions at the time were wealthy, educated industrialists, didn't really see much of the common man in terms of political representation. That is called Jacksonian democracy, and as a result of it, property requirements for voting were lifted in many states. A secret ballot was introduced for people to be able to vote without intimidation or retribution. State and federal government positions became more accessible to common men, and political parties began to develop and mobilize more of the population, encouraging greater total political participation. Jackson had an issue with the National Bank, thinking it was all elitist and they didn't have the interests of the common man in mind. So he vetoes the National Bank, and it draws a lot of flack. If you remember, we saw the cartoon of Jackson dressed as King George. We'll look it up real quick here. Right? If you can remember. There we go. If you can remember, he's stepping on the Constitution on this side here. He's stepping on internal improvements in U.S. Bank, which is Henry Clay's American system, essentially. And it's born to command. Had I been consulted, a veto memory, basically making the comparison to him as a king and a monarch, and people's political decisions that weren't in line with his didn't really matter. I know we've been over this before, but just to refresh your memory. The Tariff of Abominations was a protectionist tariff that was aimed at increasing prices on goods from Great Britain. They greatly benefited the North, but hurt the South as they had to pay more, and were hurt as it made cotton harder for the British to pay for Southern cotton. This leads to the nullification crisis and sets a precedent for nullification that eventually starts the Civil War in America, and nullification is something that we're going to keep coming back to all throughout periods 4 and 5. Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. In Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall expanded on the argument, declaring that the state of Georgia had no authority over the Cherokee, which is a sovereign nation, could only be subject to the federal government's authority. The ruling established the nature of relations between the government and indigenous peoples, as that's between sovereign nations. But Jackson refused to enforce the ruling and pursued a policy of genocide, meaning the mass extinction of Native Americans through the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the voluntary relocation of Native Americans to the lands west of the Mississippi River, but was frequently abused by government officials and resulted in some forced removals of Native Americans. Okay, Martin Van Buren ends the period, but the real only notable event, if we're hitting the highlights, is the Panic of 1837, which was an economic downturn in the U.S. because some of the unregulated pet banks that Jackson had established gave out too many loans and printed out an excessive amount of money, which led to the collapse of the banking industry and increased unemployment inside of the U.S. Okay, moving on to period 5. First, John Tyler. The big piece is the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, the boundary dispute in northeastern North America between the state of Maine and the province of New Brunswick. The controversy dated back to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolution, which failed to clearly delineate the border due to a lack of precise maps. Negotiations leading up to the treaty involved several incidents that heightened tension, including the Aroostook War and various diplomatic failures. That area in the northeastern portion of the United States has always been in contention between Great Britain and the United States, and the Webster-Ashburton Treaty kind of solidified it. Moving on to James K. Polk and the what we call the expansionist president, we see the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo happen. The big thing here, we get a lot of land in the Southwest, including California, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, and blanked on the states for a second. Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and California. Okay. This was a precursor to the Civil War. It increased tension between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions within the United States. Although the annexation process of Texas occurred during the beginning, whenever President Tyler pushed for it, it was contentious and faced opposition due to concerns about slavery and potential conflict with Mexico. So it didn't technically get annexed under Tyler, but Tyler started the annexation push. The annexation was facilitated by the concept of manifest destiny, which suggested that Americans were destined to expand territory across North America. And that's kind of the theme and influence throughout the 1860s and 70s and 80s, is that America was bound to go west. The annexation ultimately helped ignite the Mexican-American War in 1846, as disputes over borders and territorial claims escalated into conflict. Okay, last one, important for Polk, the Oregon Border Treaty. Remember the 5440 or Fight campaign slogan that he used? And we ended up joint occupying the Pacific Northwest with Great Britain for a period of about 28 years until 1846, whenever the modern-day 49th parallel was established as the border between Canada and the United States. Okay, after Polk is Mr. Franklin Pierce. Big thing here. Kansas, Nebraska, and then by proxy, the Bleeding Kansas issue. Kansas, Nebraska was a law that allowed for popular sovereignty to decide whether or not their territory would be considered a free or slave state. Kansas would ultimately be voted to be a slave state, and Nebraska a free state. Of course, this, along with the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision under James Buchanan, overturned the Missouri Compromise. Many in the North were upset that the Missouri Compromise was being overturned, and it helped lead to the creation of the Republican Party. The Dred Scott v. Sanford decision is an opinion issued by the U.S. Supreme Court that protected slavery by ruling Congress did not have the power to prohibit the practice in any territory. Further, the opinion of the court said enslaved people were property and could not be citizens of the U.S. So in any territory, the federal government did not have the power to prohibit the practice of slavery. So if the state or territory decided that slavery was going to exist within their state or territory. There was nothing the federal government could really do about it, right? And I know it says South Carolina secession here. This is in the wrong place. It should be a short little change right here. Let's do this. Okay, South Carolina secession. Let's type this in. Okay. Type this over again. Sorry, guys. Under Lincoln, the election of 1860, the election between Lincoln, Bell, Breckinridge, and Stephen Douglas. Of course, Lincoln wins the election, and as a result, South Carolina secedes in 1860, which accelerated and started the path to civil war. This is the beginning of the Confederacy, which is led by Jefferson Davis. Okay. Going on down the line with Lincoln, of course, we have the Civil War, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation that says that if any slaves needed to be freed, they could be freed, but realistically, it only applied to areas in rebellion where the government had no real effective authority. Although applauded by many abolitionists, the document didn't go far enough to appease others who had been clamoring for blanket emancipation since before the beginning of the Civil War. During this time period, you see the beginning of the formation of the Republican Party, as it was formed as a reaction to the ideas on popular sovereignty that came about as a result of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the Republican Party has a staunch exception or a staunch position on anti-slavery, right? One thing I wanted to make sure that we got from Lincoln is the Gettysburg Address. Let's open it in a new tab. It's going to cut off. There we go. Why is that one so small? Sorry, guys. Bear with me here. That one's in Japanese. That's a tote bag. That's a really bad picture. This one. Ah, wonderful. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Reference to the Declaration of Independence. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. First function of the Gettysburg Address is to dedicate the Gettysburg battlefield to the men who had died. They built a cemetery there, and it's a national cemetery now. Take a look at it here. Take a look at it here. Right, it's the Gettysburg Cemetery. Okay. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, and we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. This world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we were highly resolved that these dead men shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth and freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. Remember, the first purpose is to dedicate the cemetery grounds. The second purpose is to share a renewed sense of purpose to help boost morale during the Civil War, right? And to show that the new mission for the Civil War is to take care of America and reunite the Union, okay? One last thing, obviously Abraham Lincoln is assassinated right before the Reconstruction period, and Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. His idea was the 10% plan. Remember, 10% of the 10% of the country, or the Confederacy, I'm sorry, I apologize, it's kind of late. 10% of the Confederacy needs to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Union in order for them to be accepted back into the Union. Of course, he's assassinated, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes back over. And Johnson's plan is more aimed at the Confederate elite because of his upbringing. Ultimately, we end up going with neither of the plans, and we end up going with the military reconstruction and the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. Okay. Throughout Johnson's presidency, the 13th and 14th Amendments are passed. 13th abolished the practice of slavery. 14th introduces due process and the principle of equal protection under the law. You also see a restart of the black codes, which were defined as a series of discriminatory laws enacted in the southern U.S. during the Reconstruction era, primarily in 1865 and 66. These laws were designed to restrict the civil rights and freedoms of newly freed African Americans, effectively creating a system of legal segregation and white supremacy. Black codes imposed harsh labor contracts on African American workers. That would be the sharecropping stuff. Limited their mobility and denied them access to many public facilities. For all intents and purposes, they were a precursor to Jim Crow laws that would exist for decades, reinforcing racial segregation and inequality of the South, while it also led to the rise of white supremacist groups. If you remember this cartoon right here, link a new tab. Okay. This cartoon here, called The Union as It Was, talks about the issues of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacist groups and their attempts to disenfranchise black voters and black men and women from trying to become educated, right? Even though the work of the Freedmen's Bureau had done quite the opposite, they were still met with all kinds of resistance in the South, and would be met with resistance in the South all the way until the passage of the civil rights stuff in the 60s, the 1960s, that is, right? The military reconstruction plan after the war ended in 1865, President Andrew Johnson indicated that he would pursue an even more lenient reconstruction policy than that of his predecessor, Abraham Lincoln, although realistically it's not that much more lenient. It's about the same penalty. However, he faced opposition from the radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner that favored the Reconstruction bill that used the military. The first bill called for 10 of the rebel states to be divided into 5 districts under military control. They were also required to craft new constitutions, which had to include universal male suffrage and needed approval by the U.S. Congress. They also had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and former slaves. After completing the requirements, only then would the states be able to be added back to the Union. Temporarily, it did increase black political power, created new constitutions, or new state constitutions, and somewhat helped enforce the 14th Amendment. But ultimately, it failed to secure lasting civil rights due to the resistance in the South, economic exploitation, and the end of Reconstruction during Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency, leading to Jim Crow laws and the systemic disenfranchisement of African Americans. Okay. And the Freedmen's Bureau was a group that, over the course of its existence, had a powerful impact on Reconstruction. Defenders praised the aid that the Bureau provided to millions of uneducated, destitute, and displaced people throughout the South in their time following the Civil War. Critics point to corrupt agents, the carpetbaggers and scalawags, people who moved from north to south and south to north to take advantage of economic opportunity during Reconstruction, who they claim used the system to benefit themselves and the Republican Party at the expense of Southern whites and Democrats. The Reconstruction period ends with the election for Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes knew he needed Southern support, so he made a deal with the Democrats that he would that the Southern states would acknowledge Hayes as president, but only if the Republicans complied with the various demands. Number 1, the removal of all federal troops from the former Confederate states. 2, the appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes' cabinet. 3, the construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and the Pacific in the South. That should be Pacific Railroad. Okay. And then legislation to help industrialize the South. It ended the Reconstruction era, and Southern Democrats' promises to keep the civil and political rights of black people were not kept. And the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters through white supremacist groups, as I had mentioned earlier. Last one on the review. I know how exciting. We're finally done. Ulysses S. Grant, the 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870 as a Reconstruction Amendment. The 15th Amendment prohibited any government in the U.S. from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It dismantled poll taxes and literacy tests, but still left room for segregation language inside of the bill and in everyday life. Think about the separate but equal policies that get passed as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, and the pitfalls of this amendment never got adjusted until the Civil Rights Act of 65. And then lastly, the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is technically period 6, but still during Grant's presidency. The fake Credit Mobilier of America company, its deceptive name was based on the influential French bank Credit Mobilier, but was not connected to it, ran a fraud scheme in 1864 to 1867, in which executives of the Union Pacific Railroad billed to the U.S. government out of upwards of $44 million, overcharging for railroad construction and costs and expenses, bribing top officials, and manipulating contracts. Okay. I think I got my 30-minute time limit for 2 videos. I know I went kind of quicker through these, but we reviewed a lot of the fine print and details on period 4 and 5 in class. Once again, I want to reiterate how proud I am of you guys. I know it's been a difficult semester, and I know this class is a lot of work, but I promise you, this class is one of the most rewarding to finally understand and grasp. Number one, and whenever you start doing well, it feels good, right? This is not an easy class by any stretch of the imagination because of the amount of content and the writing skills and the contextualization and how you have to link events between time periods and make comparisons. The list goes on and on. But I think you guys are doing a great job. You're making great progress, and I can't wait to see where second semester takes us. So thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your perseverance. Good luck studying. And as always, if you have any questions, you know where to find me on campus. You're welcome to email me, Kinvo me, whichever you would like. Okay? Have a great night. See ya on the other side.